Thank you for joining the Minority Health Matters podcast, produced and paid for by the Indiana Minority Health Coalition. On our podcast, we will be providing information and discussions around pertinent health issues in our communities. So keep tuning in as we are your resource for all things minority health.
Hello, and welcome to the Minority Health Matters podcast. I'm your host for today, Jacob Heintzelman. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining today. I'm joined by our guest, Unai, and today we're going to be discussing food deserts. Unai, can you describe for the audience a general description of who you are and what your work is right now?
Yeah, my name is Unai Miguel Andres. I'm a data analyst at the IU School of Medicine and the Indiana Clinical and Translational Sciences Institute with the Community Health Partnerships. My research for a long time has focused in food systems, which encompasses, among other things, accessibility, such as food deserts.
Very cool. Can you describe how you kind of got to this interest in food deserts over your career?
Yeah, it started when I was getting my master's degree in Muncie, Indiana. I attended Ball State University. And while I was doing my graduate work there, I partnered with a faculty, Dr. Josh Kruger, who had just received a grant at that point to establish a food hub partnership that would be serving Delaware County. It needed students to help doing an assessment of the county. And to my surprise, there were high numbers of food insecurity and inaccessibility in the form of food deserts, lower income individuals that could even afford going to the grocery store, even if they had one nearby. So that's kind of when I started to explore a little bit more about the topic, which was highly surprising to me since I come from Spain and I'm used to grocery stores to be almost everywhere and being in different shapes and sizes, right? So not just your supermarkets that you have primarily in the Midwest, like Walmart, Kroger, but rather smaller grocery stores and grocers that all they do is serving vegetables and fruits.
Absolutely. Before we go too far, I think it'd be helpful if we clarified what we meant as a food desert. I can read the USDA definition, though, if you commented on how you thought that was accurate or not. So the USDA says, for a census tract to qualify as a food desert, it must meet these thresholds. It must be low income, so have a poverty rate of 20% or greater, or a median family income at or below 80% of the statewide or metropolitan area median family income. And it must be low access, so at least 500 persons and or at least 33% of the population lives more than 1 mile from a supermarket or a large grocery store. And that's 10 miles in the case of rural census tracts. So do you think that complicated, convoluted definition, is that even helpful in defining a food desert?
It is helpful for me as a researcher, but I want to start this conversation by, as you said, what is a food desert, right? We need to clarify these. And I want to set a really clear expectation here that there's not a universal definition of what a food desert is. The term food desert came because it kind of resembles the emptiness of a resource, hence the term desert, and in this case, food resources. And it was first used in context of public policy or to describe this phenomena where grocery stores had left and there were high concentration of lower income individuals in the UK in the early 1990s as part of the poverty task force that the government had designed around the greater London area. So fast forward to the present, we talk a lot about food deserts. There's a lot of definitions. Even at the federal government level, there's not a clear consensus. The USDA has, in fact, not just one, but 3 technically definitions, which is the standard of low access, low income, but you can measure the low access and the low income in different ways. So the most standard is the 1 mile and 10 miles, depending whether you live in an urban or rural census tract, or you can have a half a mile, 10 mile, or a 1 mile, 20 mile. Those all are descriptions by the USDA to identify different, what they call LILA, which is your low income, low access, or food desert areas. On comparison, you have your CDC, which they have a much simpler definition. It's an area that lacks access to fresh, healthy food, and that it's low income. And they don't put thresholds on those, right? So while the CDC is more encompassing in general, and it's more helpful for research and measurement, having something a little bit more standard like this USDA definition, it might be a little bit more helpful. However, I want to reiterate, there's not one shoe fits all. And in fact, in my own research, I use a variation of the USDA definition.
Another way that you qualified food deserts in your research involves transportation as well and access to transportation. Can you speak to that?
Yes. So back in 2019, right before the pandemic, towards the end of 2019, we released a report that looked at how access to food or food deserts had changed since 2016 to the present. The reason for that here in the state of Indiana and mainly central Indiana was the disappearance of your Mars grocery store chains that left several neighborhoods without a neighborhood grocery store. And that came after 3 years of another grocery chain closing, which was the Double Eights. However, we want to look at that trend over time and also look at how it changed depending what transportation you use. So most standard definitions, you look at some sort of linear relationship, right? Or in the case of my research, it's more of a network, so try to access through the road. But not everybody has access to a car, or not all roads are walkable. So you have to bring other things into context. And that's when we did a separate analysis of how would food deserts look if instead of using a car distance or walk distance, we use public transit by saying, I'm going to walk a quarter mile to the bus stop, then I'm going to travel 10 minutes in the bus, and then walk up to another quarter mile. And that's based on how long you can keep produce at a cool temperature without being spoiled, and also how far individuals can healthily and normally travel to and from.
Yeah, and I think the figure that you had in your paper around that kind of looked like fairly low density towards the middle of Indianapolis, but increasing density of low access as you got towards 465 around the city, which I thought was pretty understandable farther away. Is there a lot of access in Indianapolis to public transportation to get to grocery stores, or how does that look right now?
It depends where you live, right? So the higher concentration of, as you said, your transit will be around your center to north access. So that will be right now where your red line goes through, where part of the new incoming purple line is also going to go through. And then as you start going towards the perimeter areas, you start having lower access. You pass from streets like College, where you have a bus stop every quarter mile in College, but also you have then Central, which is one block, like a couple blocks to the west. And then you have stops at 38, you have like 22nd, you have all these routes that take these main arterials and then branch to the east-west streets. But then when you move towards areas like Lawrence or Pike, so your east and west side of the city, you don't have a bus every 3 blocks. You only have one route that might pass through the major street. And at times, the closest bus stop might be over a mile.
Mm-hmm. So that's how it looks in Indianapolis. Can you speak to how it looks maybe around some more rural areas in Indiana?
Yes. So transit-wide, we don't really have rural transit systems within the state of Indiana. Outside of your main cities or your Greyhounds, there's not really public transit. So a lot of rural-driven food accessibility, it comes to having a car or not, or the availability of number of cars per people in the household. So we would be looking at 2 main things. One is whether there's a car in the household or whether there's a car per each adult in the household. The train of thought being that you will be experiencing higher insecurity levels the fewer cars you have, because even with 1 car in the household, if someone has to work and they have to drive to work, that car is inaccessible for the rest of the people that live in that house to go and do groceries, right? So even though we use these longer distances to access a grocery store in rural areas, because we assume you would take a bus rather than taking transit or walking, we need to be more conscious that not having a car has a higher effect in rural communities.
And another complication to this definition that I remember you mentioning in one of your articles is that not everybody leaves for the grocery store from their house. Like maybe they leave from their work or from some other place that they are.
Yes, and that's where some studies are starting to try to do a little bit more of an ecosystem analysis. So what were to happen if you live in a food desert, but you work in an area that it's not. A lot of people actually, there's a higher percentage of individuals that shop near where they work than where they live. And then there's also the choice option that we need to account for. And there's a plethora of studies out there that have shown that most individuals do not actually shop in the grocery store that it's closer to them, even when they have it. They normally go to the second to third because of preference and or prices. You might live next to a grocery store that it might be a higher end grocery store that might not suit your budget, but you have the capability of moving. However, the key here is choice. A food desert kind of brings the aspect of not having a choice to select, or if you don't have transportation to make the choice, then there's a higher disparities. So who gets to choose? Those that are higher income and can spend money and time to go to the grocery store.
Yeah. Speaking of disparities, could you describe some of the disparities that are found in food deserts around Indiana or Indianapolis?
I'll go into both. They're pretty similar. Most in the term of who lives in food deserts at higher rates, both in Indianapolis and the whole state, African Americans or Black individuals are more prompt to live in a food desert. So it's around a third of Black residents in the state of Indiana live within a food desert versus just 10% or 1 out of 10 individuals that are white or Caucasian. And then you have individuals of Hispanic descent that are somewhere between 2 out of 5. So if you were to rank who lives in food deserts at higher rates, you would have a higher rate of Black individuals, followed by Hispanics, followed by white, and finally, in the state of Indiana, Asians, which that's a mix between a share of high-income Asian individuals and the vastly appearance of Asian grocery stores where Asian communities live. So there's a little bit more buffer in that. And then when you go looking at other aspects like age, seniors live at higher rates in food deserts than any other population group. It's also around 28%, so almost a third, I would say 1 out of 6. And then renters are located at higher rates in food deserts versus homeowners. And again, all these factors have one thing in common, which is purchasing power and where kind of historical disinvestment has taken place on. So renting units, as well as Black individuals, tend to live primarily in neighborhoods that have been historically disinvested or redlined, for example. So which that means is that money was not put into those neighborhoods for generations, for decades at a time. And that kind of extract the wealth of the community. And then grocery stores now were saying, well, nobody's spending money here because the community doesn't have money to spend. Then we're going to leave the grocery store that we have here, and we're going to open another one where all these suburbanites, higher income, white individuals are located because we can make more money.
Absolutely. So the grocery stores, they leave these neighborhoods. How do these people get groceries now that there's not a grocery store there?
Great question. It depends, right? So it depends on your social capital and network. It also depends on your income and capabilities. Like some individuals are now more reliant in emergency food systems. So that means a higher share of the food comes from a food pantry or a soup kitchen, or in a lot of family households, of kids receiving backpack lunches for the weekend from the school. And then you have other individuals that can afford driving or that have the luxury of working in an area with a grocery store that it's affordable. So it's a kind of a mix of there's individuals that are left with no other option than starve or skip meals in between. There's the group that has the chance to access some other resource, whether it's a grocery store or a food pantry. And then you have the individuals that have the capability of explore a little bit into some delivery systems. So, and that's kind of something that we have seen with the onset of the pandemic. If I had to say something good came out of the COVID pandemic, I'm not saying that it was good, but something that came that was all right was the improvement into the delivery systems for grocery stores and other products, making a little bit of a new evolved requirement of understanding how this accessibility has changed. So for example, prior to the pandemic, the USDA had a pilot project for accepting a SNAP, which would be your Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program. So accepting those EBT, electronic balance transfer credits, for online grocery stores. And when the pandemic started, they only had 3 states that were part of the pilot program and that had that in place. 4 months into the pandemic, I think it was like 43 of the states had implemented some sort of online grocery store purchase through EBT cards. In the state of Indiana, it was May 27, 2020, I believe. A couple of days up, a couple of days down. It was the end of May of 2020. And they started with Walmart and Amazon. So people that were already in Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program. So that's a federal program that gives individuals money based on their income and family households to use on grocery stores. They were able to use that online without any problem. And then they added afterwards. So that started in May 2020. By December 2020, they added Aldi as well through a partnership with Intern. And then in 2021, they started adding a couple others throughout the state. So that was one of the benefits of now you shift it into where people buy. And in that same realm, there's also other programs that have spur out of necessity, right? So in 2021, the city established a new nutrition division and community access, and named Mila Kennedy, who was at the time the food policy coordinator for the city, the new director of this new division. And they started several programs or advanced some other programs, right? Like the already existing program, which was the Lift Right program, which started serving just individuals in the far east side of the city, which provides individuals with credit to take a lift to and from the grocery store. And what it does is the first $10 of the ride will be charged to you as just $1. And then after that, we will pay anything else. And it has to go to a grocery store. That's one of the cases. Well, a SNAP recipient store, technically. That's been pretty successful at taking people where groceries are. Because as I said before, having a car changes the game a lot.
Absolutely. Yeah, I can imagine that would be super helpful for people who are trying to get to a store they can afford, especially for people on the SNAP benefits. So you've mentioned increasing delivery options and also increasing options for getting people to the stores. Do you know of any other initiatives for reducing food deserts that are going on right now?
Yes. So the city partnered with LISC Group in Indianapolis, and they started a food equity finance program. And they selected a neighborhood, which is right now the Northeast neighborhood corridor, to provide funding to establish a grocery store there. And that's kind of where Cook Medical is going to be opening its grocery store, for example. Similarly, the city of Indianapolis has a couple of partnerships to establish or help grocers be established and receive grocery items or vegetables and fruits primarily from minority-owned farms and urban agricultural sites. There's also the Good Food for All program in Indianapolis, which is currently in its phase 3, which also started in the pandemic. And the goal is to increase the amount of vegetables and fruits that are eaten by low-income individuals. So in the current phase, I think it's serving 650 families by providing them free vegetables and fruits delivery every week for 12 weeks. And at the same time, for a 3-month period, they're receiving $50 a month in cash to spend in groceries through Instacart or at Safeway, the local grocery store. And they are also, Instacart is a partner of these, so they're also receiving a free Instacart Plus membership, so they could get free delivery without any delivery fees in orders that are over $35. So those are some of the projects. Also, the state legislation, they have tried to pass some different initiatives, which would be the Health Financing Initiative. Representative Shackelford has been spearheading that effort for the last 5 years. And it always gets stuck somewhere.
Of course.
A couple of times has passed the Ways and Means Committee, which is, because it would be a budgetary bill that would allocate money to provide financial assistance to open grocery stores in food deserts. I'm hopeful someday something like that would pass.
Yeah, that would be fantastic. You mentioned that one option was trying to start new grocery stores in places with low food access. Do you think that another plausibility could be maybe just adding more groceries to stores that are maybe don't carry a lot of groceries currently, but just like maybe low quality foods?
Yes. I mean, possibilities are a lot.
Right.
What is feasible? That's another question, right? They are normally also different licenses, food licenses for different establishments, depending on where you carry it. However, grocery licenses are normally the same for pharmacies, convenience stores, and normal grocers. So that could be possible from that side. There have been some movements and some initiatives to bring fresh produce into convenience stores. And in fact, one of the chains, Dollar General, does have a specific subset of stores that carry a higher share of fresh fruits and vegetables, and maybe some meats. However, it's not sufficient. Also, they just released a study like 2 months ago of the effect that convenience stores do have in existing grocery stores by depriving access to income that would go to that grocery store. And while their statement is that they support other general means, like other households and some food staples, that's not their intent, but that's what they're doing, right? So yes, you could bring groceries to these smaller stores that are already in the existing locations, but one, do they have the infrastructure? So do they have the refrigeration they need for that? Do they have suppliers? Can they sell enough amount of money? And two, would people buy it? Right? Because we talk a lot about bringing food to people, but we also need to teach people how to eat with food that they're being given. It wouldn't be the first time that I go to a food pantry that has partnered with local producers to provide some fresh vegetables, fruits, even some legumes for protein. And individuals just leave them there. They don't know what to do, or they might not have the tools to utilize them or eat them. So
fascinating. Yeah. That's, I feel like, overlooked aspect of programs to bring more fresh fruits and vegetables. I know another way of trying to get fresh fruits and vegetables to communities is through community gardens or urban farming, or I know you've done some work around like biophilic urbanism. Is that something that you know of, how to maybe bring that more into Indianapolis?
Well, there are, in fact, a lot of urban gardens in the city, and I would say throughout the state. So first of all, there's a couple options. You can have your own individual growing pocket in your backyard, front yard, or you can have a communal urban garden. Historically in the US, in fact, before World War I and between World War I and II, there were a lot of these called victory gardens, which were community gardens that individuals used to go and cultivate together and grow food because there was a scarcity of it as a result of the war. There's a lot of movements. One of the benefits of these urban gardens and community gardens is the community building aspects they bring. So I would say, yes, they produce food. I would say it's not enough to feed a whole family sustainably because they're weather dependent. It requires labor intensive adjustments and treatments by the whole community. However, they could supplement an existing diet or individuals' diets that might come from other sources like a food pantry or soup kitchen. Or, however, the key important part of these community gardens is that community building. As I mentioned several minutes ago, how a new food desert affects a household or an individual depends a lot on their social network and the support they have. And that's where I think community gardens can help with. Because I might not have a car, but my neighbor might. And we can tackle things together. Or I might be able to get something that my neighbor doesn't, and we can kind of aid each other. So, I mean, for those that do want to start another community garden, there's a lot of resources out there. Purdue Extension Marion County has urban agriculture coordinator, for example, which is one of, I believe is the only one in this state. It's an urban agriculture coordinator. The city does have some resources on their website about how to start, how to test your soil, or what services you can get to do it, because that's something we forget. We are in an urban site, so you cannot just go ahead and grow food in the soil that might have been carrying and accumulating contaminants for years. You normally need a raised bed, which is like adding soil on top of the ground, which kind of helps with that issue.
Yeah, I know some people who've started a community garden down in Evansville, and they've seen really great results with the community building. A lot of people come back every week and feel very involved in the garden. So I think that's a really great way to approach them. I think that you really nailed that one.
Yeah, and in that aspect, some of the most successful community gardens throughout the nation can be found normally either in community centers, apartment complexes, or library sites, which are places where people already aggregate and they're more willing to cooperate at.
Excellent. If you were going to speak to the representatives of Indiana to say, hey, can you do something about food deserts? Like, do you have a recommendation for them of what you would like to see done personally?
Oh, man. A lot of things. I don't know what I would prioritize, right? So I would maybe argue for the creation of some equity funds that would tackle not just food deserts, but also historical racism and historical disinvestment by aiding any minority group to open their grocery store with support from the government, right? I would like to be strategic, right? So I would suggest them that one, we need to increase access, so reduce these food deserts, but from an equity perspective. So try to prioritize the places that need it the most and the places that have been affected the most by historical discrimination from the legislature, right? So you can do that by targeting primarily minority neighborhoods, so those African American neighborhoods and Hispanic neighborhoods that are suffering the most, but also instead of just give the money to a big chain like Walmart or Kroger, try to support the creation of a small grocer or a regional grocer that it's minority owned, right? So in that way, they could tackle two issues at once. One, reduce discriminations from the food access side of things, but also reduce discrimination in business ownership and purchasing power. I would also argue for the need to require, this would not be a state level, technically, it would be more on a federal state combination, but in order for stores to receive SNAP benefits or to be able to accept them, they would have to have a share of the footprint be dedicated to fresh produce, fresh fruits, refrigerated meats, things like that. So that would take care, for example, currently their gas stations, pharmacies, and convenience stores take a big share of the SNAP federal dollars because they're on site. So that's a way that you could force them to change into providing a higher share, right? Some sort of Indiana or federal legislation about that. And the third suggestion that I would have is if we're losing grocery stores because of, I'm going to quote here, market power, so it doesn't make financial sense from a market perspective, it's underperforming store, why not to subsidize certain buildings to remove taxes that will be taken for that property? That's something that it's done with other entities. Your tax increment financing special business districts. Why not target specific buildings that would be providing a much needed access to groceries and say, well, from the government side of things, you will be saving this amount of money that would make up for the capital revenue of your sales.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a really fascinating idea. And I think it almost goes back to what you mentioned of like European countries where there's like grocery stores just like locally in your neighborhood and you kind of just like shop locally and, kind of the people who own the store and like everything's kind of a more community feeling. And I think that could do a really big impact on food deserts here in Indianapolis as well.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, the other thing is the problem with Indianapolis and with most of the cities in the state is that they're really sprawled, right?
Absolutely.
They are not dense enough to support all the services that you can get in a more dense population, whether it's Chicago, New York, Portland, or several of the European and even Asian cities in the world. So also have some sort of policy that targets density when developing. I mean, we all love our single houses, but there's only so much things you can do when you have houses, single houses everywhere. So try to promote a more inclusive mixed-use development with multi-property condos, for example, that are affordable.
Right, that's always the target. Well, Unai, I'm really glad we were able to have this conversation. Thank you so much for coming in. It was great to meet you. I hope that this your research continues to go well, and really glad that you were able to help educate us all about food deserts and their causes and what can be done about them.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.